Oh my gosh. Wait, hold on. Look at Claude for a second. Like, where are you? Can you see him? Oh, God. He was just sitting on his scratching post. Anyway, welcome back. This is you little welcome back to AP World History. This or not AP World, AP US History. Jeez, Louise. Um, Mr. Ansharsky here. Just gonna wrap up Unit 9 real quick by taking a look at Chapter 27 about the early Cold War. Excuse me, little guy. I need to do this. Before I start the timer, these are the AP lesson topics right here. We're doing a lot, quite frankly, but this is the kind of part of the AP that is going to be a little bit less coverage than some of the other parts. I know for sure I am going to spend a little bit longer on this, so I'm going to set my timer for 25 minutes, but we shall see. So let's get into it. I'm going to start the timer. Those are the lesson topics. That's the textbook alignment right there. Three, two, one, and Joe. All right. So, what we're going to talk about in this chapter is largely the immediate post-war period, especially taking a look up at the three presidencies of Mr. Dwight Eisenhower, Harry Truman, and JFK, not in that order necessarily. Now, FDR is dead. He dies in 1945, just before the end of World War II. His vice president, someone I don't like very much, Harry Truman, is going to take over. Now, for each of these presidents, we're going to have three presidents in this chapter. We're going to take a look first at their domestic policy, some of the noteworthy achievements that are going on during their tenure in office. Then we're going to take a look more importantly, at least in terms of the theme of this chapter, the foreign policy. Now, Harry Truman has to deal with kind of a situation that would not be enviable for any president, and that is the transition from a wartime economy to a peacetime economy, this idea of demobilization. Because World War II is the thing that solved the Great Depression, as we all know. It is going to basically eliminate unemployment in the country because of the large demand for military industry. Now, when the war is over, there's a lot of concerns in the United States about the process of demobilization. Will we have a situation similar to the kind of period after World War I? Are we going to have another Great Depression? That's going to be on the minds of a lot of Americans. And kind of in 1946, when the midterms are going to happen congressionally, when it's up for House of Representative members and the members of the Senate up for election, we're going to have kind of a litmus test on, is Harry Truman up for the task? And actually, in 1946, and during those midterm elections, most Americans say no to that, actually. Harry Truman is going to be viewed as a lesser president compared to the very popular, insanely popular FDR. Remember, FDR got 4 terms, and Americans are unsure about this new guy right here. Who the heck is Harry S. Truman? Well, let's take a look at some of the kind of domestic policy concerns that happened because of that kind of Republican dominance in Congress. Now, this Republican dominance in Congress is going to be very brief. Republicans really don't take back Congress again until honestly the 1980s and 1990s. We do see that Democrats are going to have a majority in both houses. Honestly, until we get to our last unit. Yes, I know you are a baby. Um, so let's take a look at what he does accomplish. Now, Truman wants to build on the legacy of the New Deal, what FDR started in the 1930s with his, New Deal. And Truman is going to try to continue that with the Fair Deal. The Fair Deal proposed a lot of changes that would expand what happened in the New Deal. We're going to see that Truman suggested a sort of national health care service, service. He is going to suggest expanding Social Security, suggest expanding a lot of different programs that we saw started with the New Deal. Now, for the most part, this is going to fail largely is because of Republican opposition in Congress, but also because of members of his own party, the Democrats, in regards to some of his suggestions about civil rights. Now, a couple things do happen with the Fair Deal. For one thing, we see the GI Bill, probably the most notable achievement of Harry Truman's domestic policy. The GI Bill essentially was aimed at trying to transition soldiers to peacetime, and there's a lot of different things that go into that. For example, it gave out low interest rate loans for housing, for buying a home. It's going to give out low interest rate loans for starting business. It's also going to give a lot of opportunities in regards to education as well. The GI Bill does lead to a huge spike in university attendance by members outside of the upper and wealthiest classes in the United States. Desegregation, the military does happen, but other than those things, we do see that Republicans are going to be deeply opposed to Truman. They're sick and tired of 12 years of Democratic control. They want to remove a lot of regulations that existed from the New Deal era. They wanted to cut back on some of the controls that existed during World War II. Now, we are going to see that one example of the kind of return, at least briefly, of Republican dominance in the House of Representatives and in the Senate is going to be the passage of the Taft-Hartley Act. Now, the Taft-Hartley Act is, it should be underlined right there, but it is going to be an example of efforts to try and decrease the membership of unions in the United States. Unions are increased during the 1930s as a result of things like the Wagner Act, as a result of things like the rise of the Congress of Industrial Organizations, the CIO. But in the 1940s, when these Republicans gained control of Congress, largely they're looking for efforts to limit Democratic presence in the federal government. Unions, remember, were a core part of the New Deal coalition. Now, specifically, what does the Taft-Hartley Act do? The Taft-Hartley Act is going to limit the ability of workers to strike. It is going to require that unions offer sort of notice before they plan to go on strike to the National Labor Relations Board. It's going to also restrict union membership in the form of you cannot be a declared member of the American Communist Party. And this is relating to kind of some of the big other domestic policy concerns of the Truman era, namely the second Red Scare. Back in Unit 8, we took a look at the first Red Scare. The first Red Scare, of course, was largely aimed at immigrants, largely aimed at unions following World War I and the success of the Russian Revolution. Now, with the second Red Scare, it is going to be more of an intense kind of internal kind of review of loyalty in the United States government, loyalty in kind of big public institutions like Hollywood, like public education, like unions as well. And kind of we are going to see that this second Red Scare is also attributed to concerns about foreign policy, which we'll talk about more in the next slide, actually. Foreign policy is going to be majorly concerned with the spread of communism and the spread of the Soviets' influence in Eastern Europe and in East Asia as well. Some of the big names to associate with the second Red Scare, largely, again, looking at those internal threats of communism, the most famous and probably the most legendarily evil is going to be Joseph McCarthy. And that's, I guess, an editorial opinion right there. But Joseph McCarthy, he was a Republican senator. Yeah, it's probably better for you if you go away. Okay, whatever. Not Eugene McCarthy, Joseph McCarthy. He was a Republican senator from the great state of Wisconsin. He's largely going to build his career capitalizing on fear of communism. Americans had a lot to fear from communism because of large strikes that were happening after World War II, because of fear that there were spies in the United States, spies like Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, for example. So McCarthy is going to, without much proof, declare that the reason why communism is spreading overseas and the reason why there is this fear of communism within our borders is that Harry Truman and his gang of Democrats are secret communist sympathizers. And he has a list, apparently, bless you, of 150 disloyal members of the State Department who allowed for communism to spread overseas. McCarthy is going to kind of lead FBI investigations. J. Edgar Hoover is still in charge of the FBI at this point. And he is going to get some support, actually, from the House of Representatives. In the House of Representatives, this is where we see the creation of an organization known as HUAC, the House Un-American Activities Committee. Now, HUAC is going to be charged with investigating claims that other parts of the American government, other parts of American culture, society, have also been infiltrated by communists. Kind of a big name to associate with HUAC is Richard Milhous Nixon. Richard Nixon, we're obviously going to talk about him more later. We're going to talk about him more later in this very chapter. But Nixon is going to kind of be one of those zealots, excuse me, leading the charge against suspected communists in the federal government. The McCarthy hearings and the investigations by HUAC largely start to fizzle out by the 1950s, by the time Eisenhower takes over as president. But the Red Scare, nevertheless, it is going to narrow acceptable political language in the United States out of fear of being accused of being a communist. Is also going to have a huge impact on foreign policy as well, as we're going to see with the Cold War. Now, kind of Harry Truman is a little bit skeptical of all of this commie baiting, all of this red kind of accusations, but he is going to be susceptible to kind of giving in to more conservative language, largely because of his narrow victory in 1948. The election of 1948 is a complicated one. There are four major candidates. There's Henry Wallace, leader of the Progressive Party. The progressives break away from the mainstream Democrats because they don't view Truman as being too liberal. They don't view him as being progressive enough, I should say. We have the Dixiecrats, led by Strom Thurmond. They're the more conservative, more southern, racist wing of the Democratic Party. Strom Thurmond, he is deeply opposed to the gestures that Harry Truman is making towards civil rights, namely the desegregation of the military. We are going to see as well that there's the Republican, Thomas Dewey. Dewey was so confident he would win this election that he didn't really bother to campaign all that much. Mostly because, I mean, it's a fair bet. The Democrats have split into three factions. There's Harry Truman, there's Henry Wallace, there's Mr. Strom Thurmond. So, kind of, we're going to see that in this election, Truman wins narrowly. There's a famous picture of him saying, oh, Dewey beats Truman. But no. Anyway, with Harry Truman's election, though, it is going to make him kind of think if the Democrats want to retain the federal government, they kind of need to give in to all this language of the Red Scare. They need to give into opposition to going further with regard to the fair deal. We're not going to extend the New Deal policies out of fear of being accused of being a communist. However, given the nature of this chapter, we are mostly going to be concerned with foreign policy. Kind of foreign policy is largely going to be defined by the Cold War, this ideological competition between the spread of communism and the spread of American style capitalism. Now, in reaction to the rise of the Soviet Union as a superpower, remember at the Yalta Conference, Eastern Europe was up for debate whether or not it would be under communist influence or given self-determination. Ultimately, Churchill, FDR, they're going to concede to Eastern Europe being a sphere of Soviet influence. Now, out of this Red Scare mentality at home, out of Truman's kind of lack of popularity and his need to give in to public concerns about communism, we are going to see that he adopts a policy of more confrontational attitude towards the Soviet Union. Not outright confrontation, because that would lead to nuclear war, but kind of a policy known as containment. The next couple of presidents, Mr. Eisenhower, Mr. Kennedy, Mr. Lyndon Johnson, they are all going to adopt in one way or another this idea of containment. We will stop the spread of communism by supporting anti-communist forces around the world. We're going to contain it to just Eastern Europe, East Asia, and of course, the Soviet Union. Now, the way that these presidents are going to implement containment, that is what's different, and that is something that is important to know about. One of the defining philosophies of the Truman administration is going to be his 1947 Truman Doctrine. Now, this doctrine was issued in response to the Greek Civil War that was undergoing at this time. It was a war between communists and the monarchy that was backed up by fascists in Greece. And the United States is going to promise, Truman is going to promise with this Truman Doctrine that we will supply economic and military assistance to any country that needs it, that is threatened either internally or externally by communism. Now, with the Truman Doctrine specifically, Truman is willing to send American troops overseas to back up this promise. We are going to get involved in foreign civil wars, for example, the most famous, of course, being the Korean War. More on that in a second. Now, as a part of this kind of Truman Doctrine is going to be both soldiers, as we will see in a second, but also economic assistance. Kind of one example of this very economic assistance to anti-communist governments in the world is the Marshall Plan. The Marshall Plan is a billions-dollar aid project to help rebuild Western European and Greece and Turkey countries so that they do not have popularity for the communist organizations. Because after World War II, there's a lot of economic problems. There's inflation, there's rebuilding infrastructure. We need to take care of these things. And kind of the popularity of communism is noteworthy. Kind of Truman is kind of deflating the popularity of these movements by giving to democratic capitalist governments all of this financial assistance. You get Social Security, you get nationalized healthcare system. That is going to get the wind out of the sails of any potential left-wing movement in these countries. Kind of another example of this economic assistance, a very bold and daring example, is going to be America's actions during the Berlin blockade in 1948. Remember, Berlin was divided just like the rest of Germany was between an east and a west. The western part of Berlin was being blockaded as a way to starve out that part of Berlin and hopefully in the minds of the Soviet Union, have that be absorbed by the communist bloc in the East. Now, there's going to be this blockade that happens. Truman responds through an airlift program. We see kind of the allies, especially the United States, they're going to send over planes to drop in supplies to help out the West Berliners. All right. Now, it's under Harry Truman that we see the development of new intelligence agencies. We have the NSA, the National Security Agency, and we've got the CIA, the Central Intelligence Agency. Now, under Truman's watch, the CIA is going to be kind of tasked with the responsibility of spying on the Soviet Union. We'll see how other presidents make use of the CIA later. However, compared to some of the other guys we are going to talk about, well, one of the other guys we're going to talk about, the Democrats, remember, they're trying to play catch up of not being accused of being communist by the Republicans, by guys like Joseph McCarthy, by guys like Richard Nixon. So, kind of in order to make good on that promise to contain the spread of communism, America is going to get involved in permanent military alliances in peacetime. One noteworthy example of this is the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO. NATO, we're still around in it to this day, pending the release of this video. Now, NATO is going to be largely a military promise that if any member country is invaded by any outside power, but namely the Soviet Union, all countries promise to pledge to protect that currently being invaded country. Now, kind of an example of this military action under Truman is going to be the example of the Korean conflict, aka the Korean War. Now, long, complicated story short, the United States is going to directly send its troops, along with the troops of its allies, to aid the South Koreans after they were invaded by the North Korean communist military. This is going to be a rather protracted, long war, more like World War I, quite frankly, but with the intensity of the bombs being dropped in World War II, it's going to be a very, very, very stalematey sort of war, but again, Harry Truman compared to Dwight Eisenhower, who we're going to talk about in a second, willing to send troops overseas, and an example of that is, of course, Korea. Now, we're going to see that Truman is going to eventually, well, not be president anymore, and he's going to be replaced by this handsome queen right here, Dwight D. Eisenhower. Now, before we look at foreign policy, we do have to take a look at some domestic policy. Because despite being a Republican, Eisenhower is going to be more of a liberal, moderate type. He is not going to introduce a lot of new welfare programs, but he's not going to cut back on already existing ones. The New Deal, its regulation on the banking industry, the Fair Deal, its programs to help out veterans, those things stay intact during Eisenhower's presidency. Eisenhower is a fan of Social Security, himself being a rather elderly man. Now, what is going on domestically in the United States? Because Eisenhower honestly has a great 2 terms in office. For the most part, that's because the economy is doing so well. Now, the economy is doing pretty well because, well, despite that idea that we were transitioning away from a peacetime economy that we saw happen immediately after World War II, we did not end a military economy. Because of the Cold War, we're making weapons for our allies. We're making weapons for our own soldiers in the case of the Korean War that's going on during Truman's presidency. But we do see that that military-industrial kind of cooperation between the military industry, between the government, that continues. And it does provide a lot of both blue-collar jobs in the form of actually making all of this stuff, but also white-collar jobs as well. The GI Bill contributed to education for veterans. These educated veterans, they're going to become members of, well, American science. They're going to become members of American business, cooperating with the American government. Now, we also see that American manufacturing is going really strong in the 1950s, mostly because of the fact that every other country on Earth has been bombed out thanks to World War II. Western Europe is going to take some time to recover. Japan is going to take some time to recover. So, in the meantime, we're making a killing selling our cars, selling consumer products to overseas markets. And it's the same thing with farmers as well. They're doing pretty good in the 50s because of this high demand for American goods, both manufactured and agricultural. Now, we do see that kind of even though the economy is doing good, there are some positive signs. One example being kind of the rise of prosperity for the middle class. And what are these middle class people going to do? They're going to spend their money, but we don't see as reckless of spending as we did in the 1920s, buying on margin. That's gone by this point because of New Deal regulations. We do see higher investment in banks because of banking protections like the FDIC. So that means that kind of these prosperous middle class white people, they're allowed to buy homes in the suburbs. Kind of the expansion of suburbs is a very big symbol of this prosperity in the post World War II period. Where are they going to live? They're going to live in new places thanks to the invention of AC, but also thanks to the invention, or not the invention, thanks to the continuation of investment in the military. Bases like Davis-Monthan here in Tucson, that is going to contribute to a mass movement of people to live in the so-called Sun Belt. That's places like California, Arizona, and sadly, Florida as well. The baby boom, as well as going on during Eisenhower's presidency, it technically began during Truman's presidency, but this increased economic prosperity, people have money to have big families, and we do see a massive increase in America's population. Although I should note there are some downsides to all of this. We do see that there is still in the private sector anyway, segregation. These banks, oftentimes segregated. So a lot of this prosperity is being directed towards a white middle class. Kind of another side effect, unfortunately, though, is because of this prosperity, we don't really need both parents to be making an income. We do see this kind of return of an idealization of the housewife. This is a big contrast to what we saw in the 20s with the rise of the flapper. This is going to be a big contrast to what we saw in World War II, where women were working outside of the home. We go from Rosie the Riveter to Susie Homemaker. Now, another kind of critique of all of this development right here is it's not just kind of benefiting one class of people, that being middle class white men, but also we do see the criticism that it's producing a conformist society. Remember, just like the 20s, periods of prosperity, periods of mass consumerism do lead to the accusation that the economy is rather consumerist. We're all living in the same prefabricated homes in suburbia. We're all watching the same TV shows, which have the same messages, the same values. We're going to school being taught the same exact thing, that communism is the worst thing ever, that America's the greatest nation on the planet. And it is going to lead to this accusation that, well, America's a conformist society. It's a consumerist, conformist society. So we do see that there are people who reject that. Guys like C. Wright Mills, guys like not J.D. Vance, guys like J.D. Salinger, guys like, in a way, Elvis Presley. Not directly. His kind of critique is a bit more subtle, but we do see a lot of new development in rock and roll, kind of things that are breaking the mold of the cookie cutter middle class Victorian attitude type of society that the 1950s was all about. Now, another kind of thing about the 1950s, though, is as a result of this mentality that government is supposed to take care of its citizens, thanks to the New Deal, but also out of fear and revulsion from the horrors of World War II, out of a Cold War desire to improve our image with non-white countries, the federal government is going to warm up to the idea of civil rights. A very important example of that being Brown v. Board of Education. Brown v. Board is officially going to rule that segregation is inherently unequal. Separate but equal is unequal. It reverses Plessy v. Ferguson. It is going to begin the process of what will become the civil rights movement, which we'll talk about more in Unit 10. Because even though it's going to say that public facilities can't segregate, The actual enforcement of that is still up for debate, and states actually complying with it, and businesses also applying with it, that is also up for debate. We do see kind of that white states, in response to all of this desegregation, they're going to make it rather hard for African Americans to actually attend these public schools. For example, we do see the rise of private schools. We see the rise of what are called white segregation academies. We are also going to see the rise of, well, efforts to close down public education. So, 50 is kind of a mixed bag. There are some symbols of prosperity. We do see a huge expansion of the middle class. And yet, before I do the and yet part, we do see some gains for African Americans. And yet, there's lingering issues of racism. And yet, this kind of prosperity not evenly distributed among all the social classes in the United States. And we do see the status of women isn't the greatest in the 50s. But anyway, Eisenhower is going to be more concerned with foreign policy. Now, just like Harry Truman, that's a Bob's Burgers reference right there. Just like Harry Truman, we do see the continued use of the idea of containment. It should be the foreign policy of the United States, not to invade the Soviet Union, because that would lead to all-out nuclear war, but to support the struggle against communism in the places that are threatened by it. We are going to see that, however, Eisenhower approaches this a little bit differently. We do see the application of what is known as New Look. The New Look strategy is the idea of kind of having a foreign policy of containment that is not directly sending our troops overseas because that's way too expensive. Rather, we're going to intimidate the Soviet Union into not spreading its influence through things like the buildup of nuclear weapons, which is what's going on in the chart right there. Eisenhower is going to directly commit to America becoming a bigger nuclear power. Remember, this Cold War is a time of intense nuclear stockpile buildup. Eisenhower is the biggest presidency in that regard. We are going to see as well there are other ways of secretly supporting our allies overseas, sans sending our troops over there. For example, we do see the use of the CIA to conduct regime change. We see that in Guatemala, in Iran. We see attempts at that in Cuba after the Cuban Revolution. Eisenhower cuts off all diplomatic relations with the country, but there are some CIA plans to oust Mr. Castro. However, just like what we saw with Truman, we do see the use of economic assistance to our allies. Eisenhower draws the line at sending troops, as I've been saying ad nauseum, but he does send economic assistance to places like Vietnam, for example. Largely, that was out of concern of the spread of communism in Southeast Asia. If Vietnam goes communist, then the rest of the Southeast Asia area will also become communist. That's what we call the domino theory. Now, another example of kind of economic assistance is going to be building closer economic and diplomatic ties with Middle Eastern countries. We see that especially with the Eisenhower Doctrine of 1957 after the Suez Crisis, where Egypt did appeal to the Soviet Union for assistance against invasion from the Israelis, British, and the French once the Egyptians under Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal. Eisenhower's going to realize, wow, they went to the Soviets for help. We should kind of improve our image in the Middle East by allying and economically assisting countries like Israel, Saudi Arabia, Iran, and Iraq as well. Now, again, Eisenhower, lower military commitment, mostly because it's expensive. We do see he uses the CIA. We see the use of nuclear weapons buildup. That's kind of a big part of the arms race that Eisenhower really contributes the most to of any of our Cold War presidents. Now, we do see that as well. There's also the space race. In 1957, the Soviet Union launches Sputnik, the first artificial satellite to successfully orbit space. And it is going to lead to concerns that we're falling behind. We need to invest in science, engineering, technology, and mathematics education in the United States. Sorry, I'm hiccuping a lot. Now, that's going to lead to kind of a escalation of nuclear weapons buildup. It leads to the investment in American public education so that we have enough scientists to, build the missiles, build our space program as well. And yet, We do see that by the end of Eisenhower's presidency, kind of both the Soviet Union under Nikita Khrushchev and the United States under Eisenhower, they're going to realize, wow, we're kind of escalating and heating up the tension quite a bit. Maybe we should de escalate. We do see at the end of Eisenhower's presidency signs of reduced tensions. We do see, for example, the kitchen debate in which Richard Nixon is going to visit the Soviet Union, and he's going to have a friendly, kind of very friendly chat with Nikita Khrushchev. It is a symbol of perhaps a chance at more normal relations, more peaceful relations between the Soviet Union and the United States. Ultimately, that's going to be shot down, quite literally, thanks to the U-2 spy plane incident in which an American spy plane is shot down over Soviet airspace. Now, before Eisenhower leaves office, though, he's going to reflect on some of his mistakes as president. He is going to issue what is known as the Military Industrial Complex speech, aka Eisenhower's farewell address, probably the only other farewell address that you would need to know for the AP. Anyway, the message of this basically is the CIA, big business, the military, they're all working a little too close together. Maybe it's a bad thing. We are constantly in a wartime economy, basically. All right, so Eisenhower leaves. He's fairly popular after his 2 terms. Let's talk about his successor, John Fitzgerald Kennedy, JFK. Now, JFK is elected in 1960. The only reason why you need to know about the 1960 election is that one, JFK wins. Two, it's a very close one. The reason why JFK is traditionally assigned or described as win, well, the traditional explanation for why JFK won this election is because of his performance in the televised debate. Television is a new technology that becomes a lot more popular in the 1950s and 1960s. 1960, 90% of American homes own a TV. 1960, presidential debate happens. Nixon, who is the Republican, he looks like a sweaty, filthy little liar. That's not accurate for Nixon. And on the other side, we've got JFK, who looks all calm and cool and collected. He wins the election very narrowly by a very slim majority. Now, as president, JFK, being a Democrat, he is going to want to extend kind of welfare systems in the United States, even talking about extending civil rights as well. And we see that most directly in JFK's domestic policy known as the New Frontier. The New Frontier is a program designed by JFK largely with the intention of supporting expansion of welfare systems like Social Security, making a nationalized healthcare system, increasing union membership, increasing civil rights as well. JFK meets with MLK several times. However, for the most part, the New Frontier doesn't really go anywhere during JFK's lifetime. He's largely going to be stopped by those Dixiecrats. Remember those Southern Democrats that are kind of a problem for any chance at expanding civil rights in the Democratic Party. Remember that New Deal coalition, rather fragile, rather unstable. Now, we're going to see that when JFK dies, spoiler alert, he's going to get assassinated in Dallas, Texas, allegedly. Maybe his head just did that. But we are going to see that in his lifetime, JFK's New Frontier program doesn't really go anywhere. It's not until his death as a martyr for America where we do see these programs actually implemented under his successor, Lyndon B. Johnson. But more on that later. Now, foreign policy wise, this is where we're going to wrap up today. JFK, again, Cold War is one of the major concerns right here. That's mostly what he's going to deal with in his term as president. And just like Eisenhower, just like Truman, containment is the name of the game. Now, in terms of what philosophy guides Mr. Kennedy, Kennedy's young, he's inexperienced, he is a Democrat, he doesn't want to be accused of being a red, of being a communist. He's going to kind of give in to, like Truman, a lot of Cold War anxiety about the spread of communism. And as such, he's going to promise to do whatever is necessary to stop the spread of communism. That's kind of what we mean by flexible response. It is going to blend together elements of Eisenhower's new look and Harry Truman's Truman Doctrine. We do see that under Mr. JFK, there's the increase of nuclear weapons that are going to be stationed near the Soviet border, actually, in places like Turkey, in places like Italy. We are going to see as well the use of the CIA to conduct regime change or attempts at it, for like example, with the Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961, where the United States tried to invade using CIA trained rebels to invade Cuba, overthrow Castro, replace him with a pro American leader of some sort. Now, that example fails, but other things do succeed. In Iraq, for example, we also are going to see, just like Truman, just like Eisenhower, economic assistance being sent to our allies. USAID, the U.S. Agency of International Development, the Organization of American States, our commitment to West Berlin. All of these are good examples of JFK's economic assistance. We also do see, though, that the use of soldiers overseas is something that JFK is willing to do on a smaller scale. For example, in Vietnam, we send over military advisors, we send over special combat forces who do operations with South Vietnamese forces. So there is an escalation of our overseas presence, but for the most, or yeah, that's kind of what we're seeing. Anyway, kind of the big event of JFK's presidency, though, is how the world almost came to nuclear war with the Cuban Missile Crisis. The Cuban Missile Crisis is the closest the world has ever come to outright nuclear war. Basically, the Soviets put nuclear missiles in Cuba, which was 60 miles away from the United States. We're going to respond by organizing a blockade of Cuba, preventing any further military supplies from getting into Cuba. And if the Soviets don't back down, we'll go to war with them. But of course, nuclear war would ensue if a Soviet-American war happened. Now, thankfully, cooler heads prevail. JFK, Khrushchev, they make a deal in which the US promises to never invade Cuba. In exchange, the Soviets plan to disarm nuclear weapons in Cuba already. America also secretly, privately promises to remove our missiles in Turkey and Italy. All right. Now, JFK, of course, is going to be assassinated by Lee Harvey Oswald, allegedly. And we are going to see that his legacy will be carried on by his vice president, Lyndon Baines Johnson. More on that in Unit 10. So I hope you enjoyed this particular lesson. I did go over time, and I apologize for that, but we are going to wrap up. My nose is itchy. All right, have a great, blessed day, everybody. Stop, share, and end. And end.